all that means is that it was the weak link in the chain, right? So the problem now is no more contained to a handful of banks than the mortgage crisis was contained to subprime. It's just the initial impetus of everybody is to dismiss it. We don't have to worry about some huge crisis. This is an isolated event. Everything is fine. And again, they're as wrong now as they were then. I mean, it was similar to the way they greeted, inflation rearing its head, finally. Oh no, it's transitory. We don't have to worry about it. I mean, BS. They always want to dismiss a problem the minute it shows up, and they want to minimize its significance. And maybe they hope that by doing that, they can wish the problem away by denying it exists. And so maybe they're doing the same thing again. But with respect to your second question about the Chinese banks, look, I don't own any Chinese banks. In fact, I don't really own banks anywhere in Asia. I don't own them in Hong Kong. I mean, I just have avoided the entire sector because I know that it's the sector that the governments have the most screwed up
Right.
because of what they've done with interest rates, right? Banks are a party to all this, right? And so banks are more vulnerable to problems based on the way their business models developed over the years in this artificial rate environment. So they're just disasters. Now, to the extent that the banks in China may have, be smaller disasters than the banks in the United States or Europe, yeah, I'm sure that's the case, because rates in Europe and the US were always lower than they were in China. So they weren't quite as low, but they were lower than they should have been.
Right.
And so mistakes were clearly made all around the world. Everywhere that rates were too low, mistakes were made, because interest rates need to reflect the free market. They need to reflect the supply of legitimate savings and the demand for credit. And the market has to discover a price that balances everything and is at equilibrium. Just like we need the market to discover the price of everything else, whether it's the price of oil, the price of bread, the price of labor. Because whenever the government comes in and tries to fix a price that is different than the price that the market would discover, it's going to create a problem, right? So if they put a price cap on something, if they say we don't want oil prices to be above a certain level and they put a price cap, well, the result's going to be a shortage of oil, right? Too many people are going to want to buy it. Not enough people are going to want to produce it. You're going to get a shortage. And now what are you going to do? Ration, price control, all kinds of stuff happens when the government sets the price too low. The other hand, they could set it too high, like a minimum wage. The government says, oh, we don't like the wage in the market. We're going to set a higher minimum wage. Well, that means you have a surplus of workers, you have unemployment.
Right.
Employers don't want to pay the higher wage, but more people want to earn it. And so the market doesn't clear. Well, the same thing happens with interest rates. If the government says, we don't like the market rate of interest, we want to fix the interest rate at a lower rate than what the market would determine, well, what happens? Well, you get a shortage of savings, you get a surplus of debt, and you get problems in the economy. And particularly, you get problems in the banks. So I don't own the banks. I think there's trouble, but maybe at some point I'll start looking at them if I think they get cheap enough, because I think all the bad news is out.
Right.
And then, maybe there's some good bargains in some of these banks. Now, I think the Chinese economy is in better shape to weather this storm than let's say, the U.S. Or Europe, for that matter. So I think the Chinese economy overall won't be as negatively impacted by the problems in their banks as, let's say, the U.S. would be with our banks, especially if in the process we lose the dollar as the reserve currency.
Right.
And why a democracy is not a good form of government. I mean, it's not what we're supposed to have in the United States. It was not the intention of the founders, the founding fathers, to establish America as a democracy. In fact, it was specifically established to prevent democracy from rearing its head. We were created as a republic. And the founders were very familiar with the demise of democracies. They were very educated, unlike the people who are currently in Congress. They understood the dangers of government inherent in democracy, and so we created a republic. But over the years, all of the safeguards that have been built into the Constitution by the founders have basically, been eradicated, and the courts no longer really enforce the Constitution as it was meant to be applied to the government. And so we are more of the very democracy that the founders feared would ultimately be our demise, and those fears are coming true, because the problem with this democracy, as you said, is that decisions are made based on their political appeal, not based on their economic viability. So whatever gets done is going to be done based on how it impacts the elected representatives' prospects for the next election, which in America is every 2 years, right? The House of Representatives has to face the electorate every 2 years. And so they do not want to do something that will hurt in the short run, right? They're not willing to swallow bitter tasting medicine, even if it will cure the disease, because when the voters taste the medicine, they're going to vote for somebody else, right?
Exactly.
You can't say, look, you got to suck it up because in 5 years you're going to be better off. The voters are like, no, because the guy running against that guy is going to make all these commercials about, how bad this stuff is. Like, oh, you're cutting Social Security. Oh, you're throwing grandma, over a cliff. So they're not going to cut government spending. They're not going to do the right thing in a democracy. The democracy guarantees that they're going to do the wrong thing, because what's good politics is bad economics, and what's bad economics is good politics. So, this is where we're stuck. Whereas the Chinese don't have that problem. The Chinese leaders can actually think about the long term and what's best for Chinese, and they can tell them to swallow the bitter tasting medicine because they got no choice. They got to swallow it.
Absolutely.
And it's like weightlifting. No pain, no gain, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. politicians are not willing to ask the voters to have any pain, whereas the Chinese politicians can let the voters know there's going to be some pain, but you're going to get all this long-term gain, right? Not that I'm an advocate of communism, far from it. I would prefer a republic, I would prefer a monarchy to a democracy, with a constitution that limited the power of the monarch. I think the UK was better off when they were more of a monarchy, not just in a figurative sense, but literally when there was a king there, they were a much more powerful nation, under the monarchy than they are under democracy, because there's no way any monarch would have ever taxed the British to the extent that they're taxing themselves. I mean, it never would have happened. I mean, no king could get away with what democracies are doing, the governments are doing now under the guise of democracy. There would have been revolution. But so in that respect, though, given the Chinese position, yes, they are much better able to withstand this, much better to win a trade war or economic war, because they can take the pain. Not that their pain would be anywhere near as bad as the pain that we would have to actually endure in the United States. Plus, the Chinese, they're communist in that it's a communist party,
right?
But they do not embrace the communist ideology, at least not anymore, because there is a lot more free market capitalism taking place on the streets of Beijing than in any major U.S. city. If you are an entrepreneur, you're a young person and you're in China and you want to start a business, it's easier to do that in China than it is in the United States. You have fewer regulations to deal with, lower taxes, and so, there's more freedom there on that respect. Now, in totality, there's a lot of things that, where they're lacking. But the leaders know that Karl Marx was wrong, that it's not from each according to his ability to each according to his need, that we need the dynamics of free enterprise, of capitalism, that's where wealth comes from. And that's why the Chinese enjoy the living standard that they do. I mean, if they were still, operating under the principles, of Karl Marx, from Mao and all that, and, they would be nothing. There would be no industry in China. There would be no prosperity in China.
For sure.
They gave all that up because they realized it didn't work. Some countries haven't figured that out yet. Like, North Korea or Cuba, right? I mean, so they're not experiencing this economic boom. You know, we don't have a huge trade deficit with Cuba, right? Because they actually are communist in Cuba, so they can't make anything.
Right, right.
You know, we never had a trade deficit with the Soviet Union. Why? Because the Soviet Union was communist until it collapsed. And because it was communist, they didn't make anything.
Exactly.